There is a moment some people know too well. The moment you stop caring. Not slowly, not gracefully, almost all at once. A person you once ached over says something, does something, fails you one more time, and suddenly something in you goes still. No pleading, no panic, no need to explain, no desire to fix it. Just a strange and almost frightening silence. And the silence is what scares you, because part of you expected heartbreak. Instead, you feel distance. Clean, cold distance. You wonder what happened. You wonder if you became cruel, if you became numb, if something inside you broke so completely that it no longer knows how to attach. But that kind of fast detachment usually does not come from nowhere. It comes from a long history of staying too long. It comes from all the times you explained what should have been obvious, all the times you forgave what should have changed, all the times you kept giving your inner life to people who kept meeting it carelessly. By the time you detach fast, you have often been hurting slowly for a very long time. That is why the shift feels so sudden to the outside world, but not to your nervous system. Your nervous system has been preparing for that exit for months, maybe years. It has been recording every disappointment, every subtle humiliation, every moment you swallowed your truth to preserve the connection, every time you abandoned yourself in order to keep someone close. So when the detachment finally comes, it can feel instant, but it was built in layers. This matters because many people misunderstand what detachment really is. They think it is a technique, a trick, a mindset, a way to become unbothered. But real detachment is not indifference. It is what happens when the psyche can no longer afford the cost of staying emotionally fused to what keeps harming it. It is not always a sign of healing. Sometimes it is a sign that your system has reached its limit. And when you do not understand that, you can confuse collapse with freedom. That is the danger, because there are two very different kinds of detachment. One comes from wisdom, the other comes from exhaustion. One is rooted, the other is severed. One says, I can feel this and still remain myself. The other says, I cannot survive feeling this one more time. If you have spent years adapting to other people, those two can feel almost identical at first, especially if your whole life taught you to disconnect in order to survive. Maybe you learned early that your feelings complicated things, that your needs were inconvenient, that your pain made other people withdraw, that honesty created tension, that being easy was safer than being real. So you became skilled at staying connected by leaving yourself. You learned how to smooth conflict before it grew, how to explain away disappointment, how to shrink your reactions so love would not disappear, how to remain emotionally available to others while becoming increasingly unavailable to yourself. That is what self-abandonment looks like in real life. Not loud, quiet, functional, socially rewarded. You become understanding, patient, mature, reasonable, hard to upset, and underneath it, something deeper begins to drain. This is where identity loss starts. Not only when someone hurts you, when you keep reorganizing yourself around what hurts. When more and more of your personality becomes devoted to managing the emotional instability of others. When your body says no and your mouth says yes. When your truth becomes negotiable. When your worth depends on how well you can tolerate what depletes you. By the time detachment arrives, you are often no longer just detaching from a person. You are detaching from a version of yourself that kept betraying you to keep that person. That is why it feels so intense and sometimes terrifying. Because you do not just lose longing, you lose the whole emotional system that used to organize your behavior around being chosen. The overthinking stops, the checking stops, the fantasy stops. The need to be understood starts dying. And when you have been identified with those patterns for a long time, their absence can feel like standing in a room after the electricity has gone out. You do not know whether to call it peace or emptiness. This is where many people panic and go backward. They restart contact, reopen the wound, provoke a reaction, create drama just to prove they still feel something. Because still feeling pain can seem safer than feeling nothing. At least pain is familiar. At least pain lets you remain the person who cares, the person who hopes, the person who stays. But that reaction reveals something important. Sometimes what we miss is not the person. It is the identity we had inside the attachment. The one who longed, the one who waited, the one who kept trying, the one who believed that if they could only say it better, love harder, understand more, the outcome would finally change. When that identity starts collapsing, it can feel like death. And in one sense, it is. Not the death of your real self, the death of a survival role. Carl Jung understood that what threatens the ego is not always bad for the soul. Sometimes what feels like loss is the breakdown of a false arrangement. The arrangement that said, I will stay connected at any cost. I will remain acceptable. I will remain useful. I will make myself smaller if it keeps love near me. The ego may call that devotion, but the deeper self knows what it is: self-erasure. So when detachment happens fast, it can actually be the first moment in a long time that your deeper self is no longer cooperating with the lie. It is not saying, I do not feel. It is saying, I cannot continue disappearing like this. That is a very different thing. Still, fast detachment can be confusing because it often carries shadow with it. There can be anger there, contempt, coldness, a desire to never need anyone again. And if you are not careful, that pain can harden into an identity too. You stop trusting, stop opening, stop expecting, stop revealing anything that could be used against you. You call it strength, but sometimes it is just the wound learning a more efficient disguise. Jung would say that whatever is unconscious controls us. If your detachment is driven by unprocessed humiliation, it will not set you free. It will simply reorganize your life around avoidance. You will become harder to reach, more self-protective, less naive, yes, but also less alive. This is why the real question is not only how to detach, it is what kind of self is doing the detaching. Is it the exhausted self that wants relief, or the emerging self that wants truth? Those feel very different in the body. Exhausted detachment feels deadened. You do not want the person, but you do not fully want your own life either. You feel flat, shut down, emotionally far from everything. Wise detachment feels cleaner. It may still hurt, it may still grieve, but there is dignity in it. You are not leaving because you feel nothing. You are leaving because you can finally feel enough to stop betraying yourself. That is the shift. Detachment becomes real when it is no longer about punishing the other person or proving you do not care. It becomes real when it is an act of self-loyalty. When it says, I can no longer give my nervous system to what keeps destabilizing it. I can no longer make my inner life pay for someone else's inability to meet me. I can no longer confuse emotional endurance with love. That kind of detachment is not cold, it is clarifying. And clarity can feel brutal at first, because once you really see a dynamic, you cannot unsee it. You see how often you explained, how often you chased, how often you minimized what hurt, how much energy went into preserving something that only survived through your overfunctioning. That recognition can sting more than the original rejection, because now you are not only grieving what the other person failed to give, you are grieving how long you stayed disconnected from yourself while asking for it. That grief matters. It is not a setback, it is part of reclaiming your life. Most people want detachment without grief. They want the relief without the mourning. But if the attachment cost you parts of yourself, then mourning is honest. You were mourning the self that kept waiting, the self that kept translating scraps into signs of hope, the self that accepted confusion because certainty would have required leaving. This is why detachment can feel like it scares the living mess out of you, because it exposes how much of your inner structure was built around a bond that was hurting you. Without that bond, you have to meet yourself. And when you have spent years adapting outward, meeting yourself can feel unfamiliar. You suddenly have all this energy that was once tied up in anxiety, hope, fantasy, repair. Now what do you do with it? You sit in silence and realize how empty you feel. You notice how little you know about your own desires. You see how much of your identity formed around being needed, chosen, reassured, or emotionally occupied. This is the deeper wound beneath attachment. Not only fear of losing the other, fear of being left with yourself. Because if you were never taught to build a home inside, then detachment feels less like freedom and more like exposure. That is why the real work begins after the cut, after the messages stop, after the obsession loosens, after the craving loses its voice. Then comes the question that matters. Who are you when you are no longer organizing your life around being emotionally entangled with what drains you? That question can remake a person. At first, the answer is small. You begin noticing what your body feels like when it is not bracing. You notice how much calmer your nervous system becomes when it is no longer waiting for a text, a tone, a sign, a shift. You notice how much of your exhaustion was relational. You begin hearing your own thoughts again. And beneath the grief, beneath the withdrawal, beneath the silence, something else starts returning. Preference, standards, discernment, self-respect. Not the loud kind, not performance, not ego. The quiet kind. The kind that no longer bargains with what is false. The kind that says, I will not keep feeding what keeps emptying me. That is when detachment stops being frightening and starts becoming sacred. Because you realize you did not lose the capacity to love. You lost the willingness to abandon yourself in the name of love. That is growth, and it rarely feels glamorous. It feels strange, sober, a little lonely. Sometimes you miss the intensity. Sometimes you miss who you were inside the longing. Sometimes you miss having somewhere to pour all that emotional energy, even if it was destroying you. But over time, a deeper stability appears, not because you became harder, because you became less divided. You no longer need to split yourself in half to maintain a connection. You no longer need one part of you to feel the pain while another part explains it away. You no longer need to confuse drama with aliveness. This is where individuation begins, in a real, lived sense, not as a concept, as a decision to stop giving your life force to what keeps pulling you away from yourself, to stop mistaking activation for love, to stop building identity around your own emotional deprivation. And once that decision becomes real, detachment no longer looks like running. It looks like returning to your body, to your standards, to your honest perception, to the parts of you that got buried under obsession, hope, fear, and emotional negotiation. The speed of it may still surprise you. That is natural. When something has been dying slowly for a long time, the final release can look sudden. But sudden does not mean shallow. It often means the truth has finally reached the surface. So if you detach fast one day, do not only ask, "Why did I stop caring?" Ask a deeper question. What had I been enduring for so long that my system finally chose absence over one more round of pain? That question is harder, but it is more honest. And honesty is what turns detachment from a defense into a doorway. Because the goal was never to become cold. The goal was never to become impossible to touch. The goal was to become someone who can feel deeply without getting lost inside what harms them. Someone who can love without self-erasure. Someone who can leave without abandoning themselves. That kind of detachment does not numb your soul. It protects it. And one day, after the fear of the silence passes, you may notice something almost unbelievable. The space that once terrified you no longer feels empty. It feels clean. Your mind is quieter. Your body is less afraid. Your worth is no longer hanging from someone else's choices. And in that quiet, something long exiled begins to return. Yourself. Not the self that begged, not the self that waited, not the self that survived by staying emotionally fused to what was wounding it. Your real self, the one who does not need intensity to feel alive, the one who does not need confusion to feel chosen, the one who would rather face solitude than disappear inside attachment one more time. That is what makes the detachment feel so shocking. It is not just that you left. It is that, for the first time in a long time, you did not leave yourself with it.